President John Brown listened intently, his hands folded into a pyramid on his desk as the hollow transmission of Admiral Pike went on. The faint green light was animated as she went on and on, relaying the story told to her by the mercenary she'd rescued. The flotilla learned of the fall of their last stronghold in the stellar north months before their arrival, and instead of fighting a losing war or risking prosecution for the enslavement of Republic citizens, they turned stellar west to the Intakana and their satellite states, sold their captives deep behind the border, and now live like the kings and queens of old. Slave prices are very high there since so many of the Kana died in their rebellion, according to the mercenary. They put humans in explosive collars and use them as domestic servants as well as farm or industrial labor. He says they're even considering cloning humans as a new slave species and are considering the genocide of the Kana. Would they really do that? The president asked with a furrowed brow. His blood was racing in his veins as he worked overtime in his head to bottle up his outrage. I don't believe that last part, not with the Terran Republic right on the border. But if we lost a war and were crippled, maybe then? I believe it's something the Intakana would plan for. I've had enough dealings with them in my patrols, and you can just feel it in the way they look at you, like they're thinking, how much could I get for you in credits or labor? Admiral Pike shuddered. What are your orders, Mr. President? Her back went stiff as she contemplated the order she already knew was coming. Maneuver your fleet to the stellar west. Await further orders on the border. He gave the order with the crispness of an experienced commander. Despite having never served in the military, it sounded to her ears like a man used to being followed, and she snapped off a salute before he disconnected the transmission. President Brown hit the button for the subspace communication relay that would connect to every ship in the fleet and every general's personal line. This is President Brown. All military vessels are ordered to the following positions on the borders of the Intakana Confederacy, the Sankat Amalgam, the Dros Mercantile Alliance, and the Bavragan Mercenary Alliance. Report your ETAs as soon as they are known. Planetary officers are ordered to raise armies of xenomorphs and gene warriors for the course of the next year. Saul Drydock, you are to begin commissioning 40 new battleships. Border system governments, you will begin expanding your energy collecting stations into citadels equipped with the maximum number of weapon platforms and armaments of war, in addition to enough anchorages to support an expanded fleet. Are there any questions? Why? The question came from 1,000 voices, who could scarcely believe such a radical order was real. The president finally lost his temper, with outrage erupting from his lips when his body could no longer contain it. Because we know where our lost people are. We're going to go get them. And we're going to show this entire galaxy why nobody enslaves a Terran. He rose to his feet and smashed the visual icon with his fist so that every single person could see his wild-eyed and outraged expression. There is no such thing as a slaver who deserves to live. They will give back our people, and we will free the Kana along the way, and the many worlds will know. You do not fuck with Terran freedom. He seethed as the words slipped through his teeth with the slow, burning deliberation of a snake slithering out of its lair as he restored to himself some semblance of reserved dignity. But his eyes did not so much as blink. He stared into the very souls of those who watched him, and burned away any doubt that he meant every single word. Praxajan looked at the transmission from the Terran Republic. It wasn't one done in person, a serious insult to the dignity of his office. It was only a recording. But insult or not, that did not stop him from replaying the message. Give them back! Give them back! Give them back! President John Brown's hair was wild, his face intense. There was no threat of war, and worse, there was no offer of payment. It was just a single looped demand. I suppose the threat of war is implied. Praxa pondered as he searched the alien face for any hint of the state of mind behind the mask of angry expression. Praxa was not idle. As the transmission replayed for the 9th time, he had already summoned Laxajan and the other council members set to advise him in the proper course of action. But practical concerns aside, he couldn't help but be annoyed at the less-than-pragmatic approach. They could at least offer to buy our property back, he grumbled as the hiss of the door announced the entry of his cabinet. That is unlikely, Rorona Jean said, having heard the quiet annoyance of his cousin. Praxa, you don't know the humans as I do. They are a wildly different people than we. Yes, it would be easier and cheaper to just buy back the slaves we purchased from the last flotilla of the Sacred Dark, but not all humans are as practical as we are. They are closer to the Kana, passionate, emotional, and they have curious principles that trump all reason in their minds. Laxajan's slender frame and long arms became stiff at what was near blasphemous disagreement from his cousin. Rorona, you are questioning the master of our race. No, I am doing my job and advising our cousin Laxa. I opposed the purchase of Terran slaves before, and I now advocate for their swift and unconditional return. The human race is alien, unpredictable, and as we know from what happened to the Sacred Dark and the Idiaxa, they are dangerous. They waged a 7-year war with the Idiaxa Empire over the loss of one ship and a handful of scientists. And that, I remind you, ended with their ruler living in a Terran prison in exile, and their homeworld being the first expansion of what is now their empire. Rorona's 4 eyes blinked out of sync with one another in a show of distress, and his mouth briefly closed to let the rest of the council take his words into account. The implication was clear. If we fight, it might be our homeworld next. Worse, in the mind of Laxajan, he had a point. Is it more practical to simply return the captives then? To declare it a misunderstanding and perhaps pay restitution to the slaves, Praxa suggested, breaking the quiet stalemate. Yes, if we intend to repeat that act with the Kana, or the captives of the Sacred Dark, or any of the other slaves we have purchased over the years, if we simply give them back, what will the other states do? We may lose all of our labor force if we give in, and then where will we be? Ixa Jean, the Minister of Labor, protested at once. His snout trembled, his fat body jiggled as he flopped into his place in the small circle. Where will we be if we are defeated in a war? The Kana might rise up all over again, and the next time they might be strong enough to win. Rorona ventured, but before he could say more, Laxa shouted out, "Blasphemy!" Now who is being emotional and impractical, cousin? Rorona asked without missing a beat. Even with the gifts of the divine ascended Ko, we are not gods ourselves. We can die, and a Kana with a good blaster can kill any of us here, just as well as a Ko-built death stick can kill a rebellious slave. If our fleets are shattered, our hyperlanes blockaded, and our shipyards occupied, we will collapse. The Kana were badly mauled in their rebellion, but they are still the vast majority on many worlds that feed our empire. Without our fleet to hold them down, they need only do nothing, and if we cannot send armies and cargo ships, we will starve on a dozen worlds within 3 months. We will appeal to the ascended Ko, Laxajan exclaimed, and even Praxajan said nothing for a moment. They are the ones who gifted us with the means to reach the stars, to build an empire of our own, and their fleets are stronger than anything in the Terran Empire. If we, their worshippers, are threatened, they will aid us. Praxajan mulled that over in silence. In theory, the Zo were gods who guided the fate of the Intakana Confederacy and gifted them space travel as well as intelligence. In practice, he knew the reality, that the ascended Zo were a stagnant remnant of a once mighty ancient empire. Whatever had occurred to cause their collapse, it traumatized them so much that their society never expanded beyond its current borders again and relied on overwhelming technological superiority to bully younger races into compliance with their whims. But then there was that damn fleet. Laxa was right. It far surpasses anything the Terran Empire has, and they have always been willing to aid their worshippers if we make a sufficient offering. That settled it. Between the coalition of the Intakana Confederation and its allies, and the gods of their religion which held the population in stupefied awe, the weight of President John Brown's short message steadily diminished. Rorona, if the Zo assist us, can we win? Praxajan inquired. Rorona Jean was the least faithful of the Confederacy, one of the few who didn't really believe that the Zo were the gods they presented themselves as. Praxa tolerated his cousin's less than faithful view for 3 reasons. The first was that he was a relative. The second was that he kept his blasphemous attitude confined to the small cabinet meetings. And the last was that his hard-nosed, fact-based approach was vital. He could always be relied upon for sound advice. If they intervene right away? Rorona asked the rhetorical question and then answered it himself. Then we will win. Our coalition will be able to strike along a broad front, and the Zo are well positioned to strike in concert with the Bavragan mercenaries. But if they do not intervene at once? Rorona chewed on his tongue as he ran the quiet calculations through his mind. We will almost certainly lose, and if we do not, then victory will destroy us just as badly. We will send an offering at once, and then I will send a reply to the ape president, Praxa said as he settled in on his decision. What will you tell them, cousin? Rorona asked. A faint sense of dread at the possibility of war settled into his gut. President Brown sat at his desk and watched as the translation of the Inta Kana leader's words ran. Their language was complex to the point of insanity, and so it took several minutes for even the simplest of phrases to convert into any Terran tongue. When it did, President Brown's face darkened with rage. If that's how you want it, John thought, and went to check on the movements of the fleet before summoning his press secretary. The entire Terran Republic would hear the message of the Inta Kana Confederation's response to the demand that they return Terran slaves to their homeland. It would play on a looping news cycle for dissection, and then one day play in history classes where academics would dissect the simple response over and over again, until everyone grew sick of the theories about what was really meant by the words, "Come and get them." Admiral Susan Pike watched the little flotilla of treasure ships as they exited the hyperspace lane. Just as intelligence reported, the Inta Kana were sending a tribute to the Ascended Co in the hopes of receiving their aid in the brewing war. And just as intelligence reported, along with the trajectory planning AI of the Terran monitoring stations, they would pass through an uninhabited system on the Co border. Wait until they pass by the sun, then blow them to kingdom come, she ordered. The suns of the various solar systems of the galaxy wrought havoc on hyperlane drives from the most primitive to the most advanced, and while the lanes themselves compressed years of travel to a few weeks, it took as much as a month to go from one hyperlane to the next, without emergency actions that were not guaranteed to work. It meant that the Red Dawn had an easy opportunity for their ambush. The long ships of the Inta Kana Confederation were not without their escorts, but it was more an honor guard than anything else. The white sun glowed in its timeless way, burning bright in the night. A gas giant older than the Earth continued its orbit. The orange and red hues were swirling in patterns that were beautiful from a distance. But up close? Even the Red Dawn would be ripped to shreds if it were caught in the storm those patterns represent. According to the science office, those storms will die one day and are shrinking in intensity by 1% every million years or so. I wonder if it will be as beautiful then, or if we'll still be around to study what's left of it. She shook her head. It was a trivial concern made even more trivial by way of the impossibility of knowing the answer, and she redirected her focus to the more immediate issue. The Titan-class Red Dawn remained still, with minimal power going for weeks to hide it in the signal noise of the white dwarf star, and now, the proof of their enemies attempting to bribe the ancient and arrogant Co into supporting them, there was only one mission. Stop them. Make ready, Susan whispered as if the convoy of ships could have heard her if she raised her voice even a little bit more. Don't do it. The tiny voice in her head whispered to her. It was one thing to take life during war, to slay soldiers, warriors, those who volunteered or entered into conflict with an awareness of their actions. Even when the odds were stacked against one side or the other, that was just strategy, tactics, and both sides were trying to get the upper hand as soon as possible. But this was not war, and almost none of these were soldiers. Even those who were, they were an honor guard equipped for ceremony and not for combat. It's not war, it's murder, her conscience told her. Begin powering up weapons, minimal power to engines. The Admiral's order was met with a flurry of activity, and in the reflective monitor she could see similar battles being waged across the faces of the Terran crew. Turn back, please, turn back, change your minds, go home, you fools! You're going to spark a war! Just give our people back." She folded her hands behind her back to hide the wringing of her hands as she willed the flotilla to obey her and turn back, to decline to deliver their offering to the Co. "They don't know what they're doing! They can't know that billions will die if they continue on!" She heard the voice of her human spirit crying out inside her. Sweat that was not there even when engaged in battle against the sacred dark began to form on the black skin of her forehead and drip down, rounding her eye and tracing its way down her cheek. "Forward, round the perimeter and hit them as they pass. Don't let them reach the next hyperlane jump point. Lock on their engines," the Admiral said, and felt the motion of the ship beneath her feet. Thanks to the latest upgrades in inertial dampening, she knew that this feeling of lurching forward was an illusion, something created by a career full of familiar expectations when that lurch was the norm. Now it was all in her head, and the youngest officers all insisted they never felt a thing. "You're getting older, Susan," she told herself, and began counting off her breaths as they moved around the border of the sun to find the slow-moving ships of the Inta Kana religious envoy and their honor guard of the living dead with them. "Fire!" she said, and a flurry of beams and torpedoes shot out of the red dawn before the little flotilla could even properly grasp the danger. Their attempt to scramble was too little, too late, and 5 torpedoes hit dead center at the engines. 4 ships exploded. The remainder began to spin out wildly as the crew within tried to recover. The arc beams ripped through the unshielded engines of 2 more vessels, and all their ports went dark as power died. The arc emitter line of weapons was unique in that they didn't destroy in the usual sense. Instead, they overloaded and disrupted systems, to include backup systems. The 2 ships struck had now lost all power, and all backup power, shutting down all life support systems. The Admiral couldn't see or hear it, but she knew what was happening. The crews of both ships would have breath gases for a while at least, but inevitably the mere act of breathing would ensure they ran out of whatever passed for air. They would then exhale themselves to death until they choked in the darkness days later. Beams of plasma and phasers were kinder to 6 more ships, the honor guard of the offering vessels. They raised shields and got in the path of those ships they were meant to protect. The Admiral raised her hand in a slow salute to her deceased enemies, as the old ceremonial vessels showed that, beautiful as they were with their flowing lines and gold-inlaid patterns, they were not suitable for modern warfare. Each of them exploded in a burst of fire that died in the dark of space, and the powerful beam weapons of the Titan hit the religious ships, as if the guard vessels had not even been in the way in the first place. Brave. Foolish. But brave. Susan thought as her salute was lowered gradually back to her side. The ships they guarded were granted barely a few seconds more of life, but they became their own little suns, just as their guards had a moment before. The last of the ships held on for not 5 minutes more, and then there was nothing. Nothing but the red dawn. The debris they made, and 2 ships of Inta Kana citizens whose agonizing deaths were now inevitable. Admiral Pike's eyes lingered on the floating fear containers that were once sacred envoys. "No prisoners, no talking. Destroy the entire thing." She recalled her orders. There was no ambiguity in them. They're helpless. They've lost. They can't fight anymore. Her conscience told her. Her orders were clear. The easy thing to do would be to board and occupy them. The alternative was to just abandon them to their agonizing ends. Admiral Pike did neither. "Fire on those ships. Turn them into scrap," she ordered, and for a moment nothing happened. She glanced back at the weapons officer and nodded. He obeyed. Missiles soared through the night and disappeared from view. Then there was nothing to give evidence that they flew at all until the last ships of the Inta Kana exploded like the ones before them. "You're a murderer," her conscience warned her, but the reason behind her orders came to her just as readily. "The Co will probably enter the war no matter what, but if they enter when it begins, the Republic will be overwhelmed this way. We buy years of time to finish the fight and save billions of lives. The price of saving those lives is a handful of Inta ships and a lifetime of sleepless nights for one admiral. I'd call that a bargain." Admiral Pike wiped the sweat from her brow, gritted her teeth, and whispered so quietly that only she could hear her own voice. I can live with that.